Day 996 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 717,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 1,520 in the past day, for a daily value that is being sustained at an above average level, with, for example, 1,690 losses in the previous day. Especially as the Russian MOD is in a mad dash to utilize the remainder of their 2024 manpower that's been relentlessly fed into the rear, as insider reports suggest that Putin wants to take back Kursk territory and other regions before January 20. As Putin very likely fears that a Trump deal for a peace negotiation would be based on the realities of the front line, which won't look favourable for Russia in a war where both sides control internationally recognised territory of the other. So that would become an extremely awkward peace deal offered for Putin, where it has the options of, say, A, conceding Russian Kursk territory, or more likely B, conceding Ukrainian territory by swapping it for the Kursk territory, or C, and what Putin might fear the most, a deal that says each country give the other country's land back. So I would expect, on the flip side, that Ukraine would do everything they can themselves to hold on to Kursk territory, even at the expense of some Donbass land. Now, Putin could of course reject all of these deals offered to him, and many more variants of it, but his country really needs a lifeline right now, an economic one, where the dangling carrot of a potential for sanctions removal might be the very thing needed for Russia to survive this. Then to take a look at some of the hardware losses, so 11 tanks, 21 APVs, 20 artillery, and 2 air defense systems. Then as for a change of pace Friday, we'll take another look at the territory of control stats, where Russia occupies 18.39% of Ukrainian land, up 0.02% since a week ago, attributed to mostly South Donetsk gains, and done at quite the attritional cost, showing some of the biggest losses in this war, especially on manpower metrics. Now, the online Russian trolls that look to sway the Western viewpoint of a faltering Ukraine tend to make comments below and elsewhere saying Russia is gaining 10 square kilometers a day, or 20, or even one said 34 square kilometers per day, as they choose to cherry pick some numbers there. But even if that were true, taking the remaining 550,000 square kilometers of Ukraine, which is flat out unquestionably a goal of the Kremlin's, to say the least, then a rough calculation puts it at another 16,000 days, or some 40 to 50 years, to take Ukraine. And again, that's based on Russian online trollbot overestimates for daily figure averages. And yet, Russia doesn't have half a century to get the job done. They don't even have 5 years. In fact, I can't imagine it's going to look good for them in as little as 5 to 7 months, which is the approximate timeline for Ukraine's wide-sweeping use of advanced military robotic automation, with plenty coming in the form of incredibly efficient track and terminate AI drones. Not to mention other concerns like Ukraine's new homegrown ballistic missile threat, with said to be 100 of these missile types stocked and ready to go, with the capability of reaching Moscow. So these are only 2 concerns out of countless concerns that the Kremlin really seriously needs to take a look at, like that of an expected wave of Russian bankruptcies in 2025. The enemy from within. Then headed across to the map as a large-scale Ukrainian drone attack targeted Russia's Krimsk airbase in Krasnodar Krai, where reports of dozens of UAVs were said to be unleashed from Ukraine. Other local reports confirmed multiple explosions and intense Russian anti-air fire. And so what you see here is very likely the usage of the short-range ZSU-23 anti-air systems that Russia used for protecting the airbase with. They used tracer rounds of the 23mm platform that are designed to produce a visible glow as they travel, created by a pyrotechnic charge in the base of the bullet that ignites upon firing. We see it a lot, even with Gepards, and this effect helps gunners visually track the trajectory of the rounds, especially in low light conditions. Though, it does remain to be seen in this case how successful they were. With Ukrainian UAVs that could have come from any angle of attack, though it is most likely they came from Odessa, thus through the Black Sea, a pathway for which Russia's Black Sea fleet is no longer capable of protecting against such routes, as the fleet was forced to corridor itself off to safer pastures ported for increased safety against naval drones. Then moving up on the map with a lot of activity still ongoing in Kursk. Take for instance, a Ukrainian tank targets Russian positions, forcing enemy infantry to stay alert in Novovinovka. Add to that, Bradley units are also currently stationed in the Kursk region, actively targeting and destroying Russian BTRs, the APCs, with a continued operational focus that demonstrates a determined effort to weaken enemy armored capabilities. As such, with all of these hardware losses that Russia has been on the unfortunate receiving end of, Russian commanders in the Kursk counteroffensive repeat past mistakes, resulting in heavy casualties and minimal gains. Especially as Ukrainian forces continue to decimate their armored vehicles, with about 100 pieces of Russian armor destroyed in the past 7 days. And that's just for the Kursk region, where every piece of defense weaponry plays its role, as is the case with this video capturing a precise javelin strike, the anti-tank guided missiles, hitting a Russian armored vehicle also in the Kursk incursion axis. Also on the Eastern Front, the Ukrainian 11th National Guard Brigade's Samosud team launched drone attacks on a Russian Lancet attack drone south of Sudzha. This is pretty standard and not normally something I would share, but I want you to feast your eyes on the design of the Russian Lancet drone itself as it relates to a news segment coming up in a moment. Then to take a look at some of the Koreans in Kursk updates, where North Korean forces, sometimes playfully referred to as Norks, as a play on words from where invading Russian soldiers are typically referred to as Orks. So many of the Norks are reported to be currently stationed just 25 kilometers from Ukrainian positions, operating independently under their own commanders, and operating under very strict conditions, leading them to shoot anyone that comes close to their trench positions, including Russian soldiers, which appears to strongly correlate to separate earlier reports of Russians getting shot at by North Koreans in friendly fire incidents. And now, Russian POWs captured in Kursk have very interestingly revealed that they are instructed to only mention Buryat fighters, and not North Korean fighters, which is, politically speaking, a classic Russian move, attempting to play all sides, seeking all the benefits on one side of events, and attempting to avoid any of the blowback on the other side. Also on this front, and quite intriguingly, additional intelligence information indicates that a small group of North Korean soldiers withdrew from a training range after one was injured by a grenade. So it seems we're learning about training faux pas and Korean soldiers operating under very strict and isolated conditions, meaning that this is a military integration problem, with an army that requires constant adult supervision. Unfortunately for the North Koreans, the adults in this situation are the Russian soldiers for this odd couple dynamic. But hey, at least we still see the continued cultural exchange between the two disjointed Soviet-style armies, flowing with the reaping benefits, including where we see no shortage of reports of a very certain woof-woof meat delicacy already being supplied or gifted to the Russian army from North Korean soldiers. So look this one up at your own risk, if you will. It's called Nureongi meat from North Korea. No thanks. Then headed to Ukraine's Kharkiv region, as Ukrainian forces successfully repelled Russian attempts to breach the city of Kupiansk. Let's zoom in right there into that one. And this would be the eastern portion of Kupiansk, which accounts for about 20% of the population on the east side of the river. Now, this Russian contingent that was eliminated in their tracks was said to be foreign mercenaries who were sent to the land of no return. Then headed down the map to Toretsk, where the to and fro situation continues, especially in the Zabalka area, just south of the town, where most recently Ukrainian forces actively reclaimed key positions in that area, steadily pushing back enemy lines. So it's happened before and likely to happen again. Then to head further south on the map to the Kharkova direction, where it's all about the village of Dalny in most recent times, essentially with the Russian highly attritional midwave insurgencies designed to establish a bridgehead, done so as a means to encircle the region, not so much the north, but for the south, which would certainly be the intended goal here. And we can also see the straight line positions of the Russian forces just beyond, not due to any water bodies, any rivers, anything like that. It's purely just the tree line, used as a partial means of protection, but as we've seen, that doesn't always work. And where they extend beyond that location, it gets very dangerous for the Russian forces, which is sometimes an accepted methodology of warfare for their Russian military doctrine, but sometimes not. So it always depends if they're going to run into open fire, if you will. It just depends on the spot on the map. Then next, on this axis, the AFU Skala Battalion reports capturing 2 prisoners near Shakhtarsk. Then to something quite noteworthy, because over 100 kilometers east of here, Russian officials evidently declared mass grave sites near Snizne in the Donetsk region, containing approximately 6,000 Russian soldiers listed as, quote, missing in action. Apparently, within the Russian military space, the situation draws attention as investigations into the claims are underway. The claims being that Russia doesn't really count its own losses, even under private circumstances, with many losses considered missing in action, as mentioned like before, and sometimes as deserters. Also, another concern being that in this event, Russian commanders have been collecting pay of those missing in action, quote unquote, members of their army. Though I expect they collect the pay from the ones that they don't list off as missing in action. Now, generally, soldiers don't get paid after joining the army, particularly the frontliners, those Russian frontliners. But those of the Russian soldiers in the rear, beyond, say, the third line of defense, they're the ones that more often do get paid, at least as it currently stands. But as for this story of a Russian investigation, it's likely to get shut down, closed, finished, with a positive report of nothing untoward happening. I'm surprised it's getting this far. Then to briefly take a look around the map today, as somewhere in the east, Ukrainian soldiers from the 425th Separate Assault Battalion advanced on Russian positions in the Pokrovsk direction, utilizing an American 1117 armored personnel carrier. The operation unfolded as they engaged enemy positions head-on, clearly taking on fire but not getting hit. At least not a hit that disabled the vehicle. As in the longer form of this video, there was a strike on the vehicle, but it didn't actually do much. Then, also in the east, the Russian army faces ongoing de-Starlinkization efforts, disrupting their communication networks. So this initiative aims to weaken their operational capabilities in real time as they get taken out by AFU drones. Now, as for the Starlink terminals possessed by Russia, they pay about 5 times the retail price by acquiring them through back channels, but they're said to not last very long these days. And not just due to FPV targeting, although that is one element, but it's also because they become automatically deactivated due to coordinated efforts between SpaceX and the US Department of Defense, where the unauthorized terminals get identified and blacklisted. And I would expect this will become an even faster and more efficient process as time goes by. Then, also in the east, and worthy of a mention, Ukrainian forces destroy a Russian Zoopark-1 counter-battery radar at the front, $14 million worth right there. Then headed across to some news for today. So a French military task force named Champagne concludes its mission training a newly formed brigade of Ukrainian soldiers who are set to deploy after 2 months of intensive instructions in France. With over 2,000 troops finalizing their preparations, the brigade, equipped with heavy French weaponry, artillery like 18 pieces of French Caesars, the howitzers, and an additional 18 pieces of AMX-10 light tanks, readies itself to take on the Russian threat in the Donetsk Oblast. French authorities also have said that the newly trained Anne of Kiev Brigade, named after a Kiev princess turned French queen, will become a 4,500 strong battlefield force comprising of infantry, engineers, artillery, and specialists. So with over 20 countries now training Ukrainian troops to NATO spec, the difference is just simply night and day when it comes to the training that Russian soldiers get. Then headed across to some Russian hardware news, as North Korea is now supplying Russia with self-propelled guns, marking a significant escalation in their illegal military cooperation. A recent geolocation confirms the presence of North Korean Koksan 170mm howitzers in central Russia. Developed in the 1970s, these howitzers, based off a Chinese Type 59 tank chassis, which is a variant of the Soviet T-54 tank, has rate of fire estimates to be about 1 to 2 rounds per 5 minutes. Now, to add some needed context there, this is a great deal slower than your average NATO SPG. Take for instance the Ukrainian-operated BZH-2000, which can fire 10 to 12 rounds per minute, sustained for short periods of time. Then we've got Ukraine's own developed Bodanas, which can fire 6 rounds per minute. Let's not forget also Ukraine's Polish-operated Crabs fire about 2 rounds per minute, but also contain a rapid mode of 18 rounds over 3 minutes. So back to the North Korean Koksan. It's operated by a crew of 8, with some members transported in separate support vehicles due to limited space on the SPG. And it's really hard to know where to start with communicating the issues here. But rattling off a few concerns, for this platform there's going to be some severe maintenance challenges, training challenges, expected accuracy challenges for these platforms that use outdated technology for firing. There will be issues with mobility. Apparently they're quite slow, up to 40 kilometers per hour. And with that slow rate of fire I've just mentioned, leading to counter-battery vulnerability, as if they try to get 2 shots off within 5 minutes at the one location. It just makes them an easy target for Ukraine's advanced artillery systems. Oh, not to mention a partially open turret design, increasing crew member vulnerability. But the most important factor here is the 170mm shells. You probably haven't heard of them. There's a good reason why. Russia doesn't make or use these shell calibers, which of course represents some significant supply chain challenges and reliance on North Korea ammunitions, which, as we've seen to come, the Kim dynasty will be sending the oldest and most defunct of stockpiles in limited volumes from half a world away. Then headed across to some North Korean hardware news, if you will, as it's very much appearing to be that the Botox Tsar exchanges technology with Kim, securing North Korean manpower for future endeavors. And so with this latest insight, Kim oversees tests of a UAV that is very, very closely resembling of Russia's Lancet drones, which I can only imagine that South Korea is finding this to be significantly escalatory. And also surely having them start developing intercepting counter drones, if they haven't started already, that the high-tech nation of South Korea would then very likely perform a real world of testing in what's very quickly turning out to be now allied nation of Ukraine. Then headed across to another Russian state media TV segment. So in another of these, and it gets pretty dark, as in the latest late-night episode with Russia's top propagandist Uncle Solivov. Well, the talking points are actually starting off with a very positive and peaceful sounding vibe here, where one panelist describes or states, quote, "There is no intelligence that confirms Russia's malicious intentions towards the Baltic states." So isn't that nice, guys? The Russians are so benevolent and sweet and compassionate. But in the very next statements, and practically within the same breath, the two here complete their thoughts in the most darkest turn in a conversation that you could possibly imagine, where they then go on to say that destroying these worthless statehoods is not a malicious plan. It's just a liberation of lands and the restoration of rights of Russian-speaking people, where they then also follow up once again to say, there is nothing malicious here. Russian logic at its worst. Oh, and then for them only to follow up by saying they'll only do it in a purely amicable and military way. Huh? I think everybody knows by now exactly what is meant by Russia's amicable and purely military way. What a total load of Russian BS logic. No, certainly not malicious at all. So I'll move on to something a bit lighter to round off the video with, but I felt that it was important to show this, as it's pretty important to see how Russian media just foams at the mouth as they become more and more shameless, which is indicative and very telling of exactly where their Russian expansionist ideologies lay. So to head off to that funny, now it is actually of a slightly darker nature, but I'd say with a happy ending, as we came across this footage of future Moscovian soldiers of extremely low morale, perhaps some of the lowest morale you can find, showing the moments just before they escaped from the barracks in Russia's Novosibirsk region. Clearly they had the expectation that they were going to be forced to go to the SMO because they never received their not fit for service medical certificates from doctors who never came. And based on what we see here, I'd say it's a fair enough assessment to say that, and I know you're thinking it, these bottom-of-the-barrel new would-be recruits suffered not from a physical condition, but from that of the old noggin instead. But just like Jack Nicholson, they did end up getting their vacating happy ending. So that is it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. I've just switched out my recording software, so let me know if it feels the same, better, or worse. I always do love a bit of feedback. So thanks again, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.